And I want to thank, and I want to thank I want to thank you not only for producing a great, very intelligent son, but for doing something that a whole lot of us really, really appreciate, and we're very happy to have you here. And I'm happy to have Michael here tonight. I heard Michael at a conference speaking about education. He gave me a copy of his book. I read the book. My wife read the book. We talked about the book in bed, and so that's a very good sign. It is a brilliant book, and I'm very happy that Michael could be here tonight to tell you guys about it. I'd like to introduce Michael Ellsberg. So I'm going to open tonight's talk with a shocking headline that I read recently from one of our nation's most trusted and respected news sources, The Onion. And the headline reads, "New college graduates to be cryogenically frozen until job market improves." So we can laugh about it. I love The Onion. But the headline points to something actually very, very serious that's happening right now that actually isn't a laughing matter for any of us or for any of the young people that we know and love. And that is that there's a full-blown economic and jobs crisis among America's youth. Both college graduates, people who are in school looking for summer employment, who haven't finished school, young people across the board are having an unbelievably hard time finding economic opportunity right now. Here are just a few statistics about it. Here's another headline from a slightly less reputable news source, the New York Times, and it says, "Many with new college degree find the job market humbling." And it goes on, it says that right now, of college graduates under the age of 25, 22% of them don't have jobs. Now let's just put that in a little bit of context. The Great Depression, unemployment overall was 20%. So essentially what we have right now for young people, and these are people with college degrees, is a depression for young people right now. And of course, we can talk about this later. I'm sure people will bring up the point that people without degrees are doing much worse, and that's true overall on average. I'll address that point later and in the questions. But right now, let's just talk about what is happening with people who have gone through the system. 22% aren't finding jobs in recent years. The article also points out that of graduates, another 22% aren't in jobs that require any kind of formal education. They're at Starbucks, they're waiting tables, that kind of thing. So 44% did not require their higher education for their employment or their unemployment. And if you look, the picture's much better for engineers. That's one thing where the job prospects really are quite good if you go to an engineering program. But for humanities majors, it's much worse. 56% aren't in a job that required any kind of higher education. So there's this huge crisis going on right now. Just to put this in a little more global context, here's another interesting headline. This is from the blog of a gentleman called Mike Consul, and he's a policy analyst with the Roosevelt Institute, and he wrote a piece called "Youth Unemployment in the United States in Line with Arab Spring." Youth unemployment in the United States in line with Arab Spring. So we've just seen this remarkable year of uprising around the world, and of course that had to do with many things. It had to do with political oppression, with corruption, but it was largely youth-led, and clearly one factor that was driving that was the incredible unemployment among young people in these countries, in the Middle East countries. The article had a few statistics. Egypt, which had a revolution led largely by young people, 25% unemployment at the time of Arab Spring. Tunisia, another revolution, 30%. Libya, according to another statistic, 40% youth unemployment. So there seems to be this tipping point when youth unemployment gets to around 25%, when people are realizing that something's not working, and people uprise, they go out in the streets, and if we're not careful, we're almost at those numbers. If we're not careful, we might see that kind of uprising here. Oops, did I just say that? Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Oakland, Occupy San Francisco, Occupy everything. We are seeing our own Arab Spring here. We are seeing this youth revolt, youth uprising here. And again, that has to do with many, many different things. But clearly, one of the things that is, if you look at what people are talking about, what their signs say, what the websites say, a lot of it is about this outrage of having checked off all the tick boxes. I went to college, I got my good SAT scores, I did everything he said, and I can't get a job. And there's this enormous amount of outrage around that situation. And this is something that is relatively new. So all of our assumptions about education and all of the things that we believe about it, about higher education, were formed in kind of the golden age of higher education, which is the post-war years and the GI Bill and this massive expansion of educational institutions and massive expansion of the industrial base of the economy, growing economy. So we have all these beliefs about it, and we haven't adjusted our beliefs to what happens when the economy changes massively. And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So we've got a full-blown youth economic crisis, and what is the solution? So if you ask most people, what is the solution to this problem? The answer comes very readily: more education. If the education they've got isn't working for them, well, let's get some more. Let's double down. If you don't have a BA, go get a BA. If you got a BA, go get a master's. If you got a master's, go get a PhD. Go get an MBA. How about, why don't you go get an MA in interdisciplinary communication studies? That'll be your ticket to economic opportunity. That's the thing you're missing, is an MA in interdisciplinary communication studies, and then you will be set for life, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm here to argue the opposite of that. Now, if you don't get shocked, if you don't get angry, or at least you don't think about some common held assumptions, I will personally refund your ticket price at the end of this. That's what I'm here to do, is to make you think about some commonly held assumptions and hopefully get you riled up a little bit. So most people say more higher education is our way out of this youth economic crisis. I'm going to argue the opposite. My argument is that actually it's not the way out. More higher education is not the solution to the youth economic crisis. It's actually, in large part, the cause. Now that's a shocking statement. What could I possibly mean by that? How could I say that higher education is in part causing this youth crisis right now, this youth jobs crisis? Well, 3 reasons. Number 1 is debt. Number 2 is the decline of Fortune 500 companies as an engine of job growth. And number 3 is the opportunity cost of going to college, the things you don't learn when you're in class learning what's on the curriculum. So let me go through these. Number 1, debt. So you've all probably heard personal finance people talk about the dangers of credit card debt, and we've seen recently what the dangers are if you bite off more home debt than you can chew. And right now we are about to see a crisis on the same proportions around student debt. Student debt just passed $1 trillion, and which means it also passed the amount of credit card debt outstanding. So I don't know how that compares to home debt, but if you compare student debt, it's now far more than all the credit card balances in America, which is saying a lot because we love our credit cards in America. So basically we're telling young people to put their higher education on credit card, more or less. And that leads to an average of $24,000 of student debt coming out, $24,000. That didn't used to be the case. Again, this is a new landscape we're in, right? I talked to people who went through Berkeley in the, in the 60s. It was, a couple $100. Even with inflation, that was worth a lot more back then, but even still, that's not the crazy prices of tuition that we're seeing. The average price for private education now is $12,000 a year, so $48,000 for private education. Most of that, for the people who are going through it, is going right on the credit card, essentially. Of course, there's outliers. The most expensive college in the nation now is Sarah Lawrence at $58,000. Wow. we're about to see, within a year or two, our first $60,000 school year being sold on the market. That'll probably be Sarah Lawrence, very likely. So think about that. That's roughly $60,000. So we're getting at almost $250,000 we're saying you have to spend to have access to the job market. Now again, I'm going to talk about the issue of how dropouts fare, which on average is worse than that, and I'll address that, but right now we're just talking about how graduates fare. So here's a story I read when I was researching this. A young woman named Courtney Muna graduated NYU in 2005 with $100,000 in debt. So the average is $24,000, but now we're starting to see young people at the start of their adult lives with $100,000 in unsecured debt at the start of their adult lives. And so this was one such young woman. She took that out to get a undergraduate liberal arts degree in religion and women's studies. At the time that I read the article in 2010, she was earning $22 an hour as an assistant to a photographer. Now, last time I checked, you didn't need to have a degree in women's studies and religion or any degree to be an assistant to a photographer, and it's highly dubious that you needed to take on $100,000 in debt to get that job. Now, let me be clear about something. This is a very, very this is a very dangerous situation that this young woman has gotten herself in. And in fact, that most young people who get in debt and then can't find jobs are getting themselves in. You know, in the housing boom, if you took out more debt than you could handle, if you got one of those no-doc loans, one of those no money down loans for your second vacation home, or whatever people were doing and all that madness, you could declare bankruptcy. It wasn't going to be pleasant, but you could get out of that debt. You could essentially hand the mortgage company the keys to the house and you'd be out. Not saying it'd be fun, but there were ways out. Student debt is one of the only types of debt that is not dischargeable in bankruptcy. So if that investment does not pay off for you, you're in deep, deep waters there. And that can be garnished, they can garnish your Social Security benefits. There's no one yet, because the student debt issue wasn't around in the 50s and 60s, so we don't have people having their Social Security wages or benefits garnished right now for student debt, but we will be. We are going to see a massive, massive wave of defaults on student loans, and actually we are seeing that. Again, the New York Times reports that year over year, 2010 from 2009, student loan defaults the rate went up 25%. So the current rate is 8.8% of young people defaulting on their student loans. Again, that's not a pretty picture when you default on your student loans. It's an extremely serious situation. All kinds of penalties kick in. You see stories of people who can't even make their interest payments. So interest is going on top of interest, and it's ballooning upwards. If you Google the word student debt suicide, there's actually a number of stories about this. You know, this didn't happen in the 50s and 60s because there was no student debt, because the college cost $800. But now student debt suicide, I'm not saying that's the bulk of the trend, but it's the tip of it right now. We're seeing, if you check with the pulse of the occupiers, of the people who are really starting to raise this issue, there's an enormous amount of sadness, fear, frustration, rage that I think is, if we don't address it, is going to see some kind of cataclysmic uprising around it, like has seen in Arab Spring, because it's just not sustainable. You can't have young people getting into that kind of debt who can't find jobs to pay it off and then can't go into bankruptcy, and this is the start of their adult lives. They're in this situation. So I'm going to talk about the next issue here, the next cause, which is the decline of Fortune 500 companies as engines of job creation. I know I'm a bit somber here. I'm going to get into the hopeful stuff at the end. Bear with my somber for one or two more points. So decline of Fortune 500 companies. So again, our current education system, higher education system as it exists now, was designed roughly in the 50s and 60s that was a time of American predominance around corporate growth, and we were the unchallenged leaders in growth. These large companies were coming to being or growing, expanding industrial base. They needed expanding ranks of middle managers to fill all the industrial base in the factories, and the education system did very well to pump out people who could be those managers. And that was the system that we had in place. Of course, we live in a very, very different universe now. Now we live in, American manufacturing has almost disappeared. We're in the age of outsourcing, downsizing, offshoring, automation. There's a book that I just donated recently to a Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign for a book called Will Robots Steal Your Job? And so there's all this automation happening, and we're just in a very, very different economy right now. And so a study from the National Bureau of Economic Research, actually, excuse me, I'll get to that in a moment. Another study from education think tank called the Kauffman Foundation compared who was adding jobs in our economy and who was taking them away. And so we think of these large companies, they must be large, they're large, so they must be the ones adding all the jobs. Actually, that's not the case. The large corporations, they do hire a lot, but they also fire a lot, they downsize a lot. And this study from the Kauffman Foundation found that the large corporations in America were actually net job losers. So they hire a bunch, but they fire more to downsize, and they're net job destroyers. So where does job creation come from? That was actually the title of this study. And the study said, startups aren't everything when it comes to job growth, they're the only thing. Startups aren't everything when it comes to job growth, they're the only thing. So now I'm going to get into a little bit more of the hopeful side of this talk. So we have this moribund, stagnant system where people have gone through the system to get these entry-level jobs at Fortune 500 companies. The companies are downsizing, offshoring, there's no jobs there. So where are the jobs? So jobs are happening right now in startups. Another study from the National Bureau of Economic Research found that nearly all net job creation in America comes from startup businesses. Now, I want to make a distinction here between, you often hear that small businesses are the engine of job growth, but the study actually makes a distinction between small business and startup businesses. Because most startups are small, they get inflated often, but the ones who are really added jobs are new businesses. Now, we know here in San Francisco, in the cradle of innovation, Silicon Valley, that a lot of these startups that add jobs, the jobs will be gone in about a year because the startups will be gone. But the study found as long as there's enough of these startups that are out there adding jobs, as long as some of them stay alive, and some of them do, they're net job creators. So think about it, they go from zero to some amount. So if some number of those organizations stay alive, they're going from zero to that amount. And if you think about it, startups are really the only area of the economy where one metric of success is how many jobs you've added, right? I know a lot of entrepreneurs who are here in this room, and a startup will talk about, oh, we have 5 employees now. Oh, we just went to 10. We just went to 100. We just went to 500. So that's a metric of success, right? Can you imagine someone in a Fortune 500 company saying, well, we just went to 50,000 jobs or something like that? They talk about how to get rid of jobs. That's the conversation they have. So it's all about startups. Again, this is a relatively new phenomenon. Obviously, startups are not a new phenomenon, but this entrepreneurial economy where everyone is doing a startup, and there's a culture of entrepreneurialism and a culture of startups. This is a fairly new phenomenon in a culture of venture financing, and it is recent compared to our education system, and our education system hasn't really caught up, but that's where the jobs are happening. So the last point I want to talk about on this question of how our education system is funneling into the youth unemployment crisis is the issue of opportunity costs. So on this topic of startups creating jobs, there's a great blog I just found called Working for Wonka, Surviving a Startup. And it's the first blog, so far as I know, about how to get a job in a startup. Not how to be an entrepreneur, which I think is a great thing, and I think more young people should be entrepreneurs, but not everyone's going to be an entrepreneur. There's some people who just want a job. But the jobs now are at the startups. So this is the first educational piece I know of, that blog I found, about how to get a job in a startup. And this woman who writes it, her name is Kathy Verbeck, and she has a piece entitled, Why You Must Drop Out Now to Get a Job Later. And she says, if you're looking for a job, you better start looking at startups. And the best way to get a job at a startup is not by going to the best school. The best way to get a job at a startup is by bringing the best street cred, specifically startup street cred. That's what I want to talk to you about is opportunity cost, is that our education system was designed to help young people get entry-level jobs at large organizations, either governmental organizations or large Fortune 500 companies. And there's a set of skills that you learn that are very useful to that, and it's done very well in helping young people get those jobs in the past. But there's a whole different set of skills that is involved in being in a small, dynamic company that just isn't taught in school. You learn it by doing. It's not an academic discipline. It's something that you just have to be in the trenches, and you have to accumulate some wounds and have some blood spilled to know what it's like to go through that kind of early day startup experience. And this article is arguing that that's the kind of experience that young people should be getting. They should be in the trenches with where the dynamism is happening in our economy and accumulate the kind of street cred, the kind of entrepreneurial resume, if you will, which looks very different than, say, a management consulting resume. And that's what's going to allow them to get into this sector of the economy where there's a lot of dynamism happening. Not to mention that I hope more of these young people just create their own job, right? I mean, many of them don't want to be entrepreneurs, but we need some percentage of people to be starting these companies, or else the jobs aren't going to be there. So not only working for startups, but learning how to create businesses. So there's this huge opportunity cost where I'm talking about people who are motivated and ambitious. If you have a situation where a young person just doesn't have any drive, doesn't have any ambition, it's very hard to make an entrepreneur out of that kind of person. There has to be the pre-existing passion, the pre-existing will, drive to learn. So let's just take the population of young people who are motivated, who are ambitious, who want to do things about their lives, with their lives already. And you take some portion of that population, or most of it, and put them through our current academic programs, and they're learning one set of things. But that means they're not learning a bunch of other things during that time. They could learn it later, but during those 4 years, leading up to when they're going to be 22 and looking for jobs, they're not doing anything remotely relevant to what would make an entrepreneur want to hire them. So I spent 2 years interviewing people who just decided to opt out of that whole system. They saw the problems, they weren't interested in that kind of learning, and maybe they weren't good at it, and they just decided to educate themselves. So I interviewed people who either dropped out of college or just didn't go, and then went on to become entrepreneurs. Some of them are very famous, some of them became insanely wealthy. I interviewed a few billionaires, Sean Parker, founding president of Facebook, who, by the way, is very different in person than Justin Timberlake plays in that movie. And Matt Mullenweg, who founded WordPress, which I run my own blog on, and probably a lot of you who have blogs are familiar with WordPress. So those are the famous people and the very wealthy people, and you could say, oh, well, they're outliers, right? They're the ones who got lucky. And there is some aspect to that. That kind of wild entrepreneurial success, especially when you're talking about someone who becomes a billionaire, that, yes, they worked hard, yes, they're brilliant, yes, they had great ideas, but there was an enormous amount of luck and serendipity that goes into having that level of success. But if we, as a society, decide that anyone who decides to start a business, if they're successful, that they're an outlier, we've got a big problem on our hands, because those are the people who are going to be creating our jobs. So if they're outliers, we don't got any jobs. So that is the danger we're in a system that wasn't really designed, doesn't understand entrepreneurialism, doesn't understand the kind of skills, the kind of resume credibility you need to have to function in that ecosystem, which is very different than the kind of credibility you're going to need if you want to get, say, a job at an investment bank, for example. So I spent a couple of years interviewing these people. I wrote a book called The Education of Millionaires, and I talk about the kind of things that you can learn on your own. Now, you can learn these things after college, and in fact, I wrote my book with the intention that it would be a guide for young people who just graduated. This is the book that I wish I had, and I did graduate. I went to Brown and graduated in '99. This is the book I wish I had when I graduated. I didn't, so I wrote it. These are the kind of skills, you can learn them later, but that's if you want to play that game of being 22 and having just spent 16 odd years of your life going through this formal education system, and now not knowing what you want to do, having a hard time finding a job that makes use of your credential, 50-50 shot of that, and a 25% shot of not even having a job. And I wanted to give the skills that you could learn if you just decide you want to not have that system, not go through that system. So I talk about street cred, street smart skills, not book smart skills, that actually make it very likely that you'll be able to find economic opportunity for yourself. I talk about the importance of learning how to build a network. That's key. Most of these, if you want a job in this dynamic sector of the economy, in general, it doesn't happen through submitting a cold resume to a stranger. In general, it happens through who you know. And networking it has a bad rap. People hate the word networking. It seems kind of schmoozy or sleazy. But I try to rebrand that term because it's an essential skill. And if we don't encourage young people to start building their networks young, and networks of business owners or potential business opportunity, they're going to be stuck sending resumes through Craigslist. And I don't know if anyone here has ever sent out a resume through Craigslist, but it's not a very fun experience. You don't hear anything back, you just sit there and you hear crickets for months, possibly. Business owners I know, when they do post these ads, they often get 2,000 resumes for positions. I've heard of high-level ones getting 2,000 resumes. It's very common to have 200. That's an extremely normal, that's a normal number. If you post a job, you're going to get 200 resumes. So everyone's competing on how can I make my resume look good. Well, you're trying to look good in a pile of 200. This is 200 pages about. So you're trying to look good at somewhere in the middle of a stack of sheets right there. And you're going to look a lot better if you actually know the person. So I talk about networking. I talk about sales. Another skill, if you learn how to sell, most of the people that I interviewed for my book had some kind of sales training very young. Often it was door-to-door sales, which I don't think in general that's a very uplifting or positive thing in society, but these people cut their chops. They learned sales skills, whether it was that or just getting in a position where they're learning to sell. That, again, is a really easy way to create economic opportunity for yourself. It's a non-academic discipline. You don't learn it. Even MBA programs, typically you don't learn sales. So there's all these real-world kind of chops out there available. And my argument is that in this economy where we are facing some very, very challenging situations for young people, we're doing them a disservice by telling them not to learn those things until 22. And I just think that's too late. I think I've talked to too many young people who are just doing amazing things right now. You can go with the internet, you can start social movements. Young people are starting all kinds of movements, businesses, campaigns, things where they're out in the trenches doing real things.